The morning sun painted the Hawaiian sky in shades of gold and crimson. December 7, 1941. George Walters was just a dock worker, a civilian, no uniform, no training. No idea that in the next 2 hours he would save 17 lives and become a legend whispered about in naval archives for decades to come. Pearl Harbor was supposed to be paradise, the safest posting in the Pacific. Sailors wrote home about the perfect weather, the peaceful mornings, the feeling of being untouchable. America was at peace. The war was an ocean away, until it wasn't. George had worked the docks for 3 years. He knew every ship, every sailor, every routine. That morning he was early, coffee in hand. The harbor stretched before him like glass. Then he heard it, a sound that didn't belong. The drone of engines, too many, too low. The first bomb fell at 7:48 a.m. The explosion shattered more than ships and steel. It shattered an entire nation's illusion of safety. George dropped his coffee. The cup shattered on the concrete. Around him, men froze. Trained soldiers stood paralyzed. But George moved. While others ran from the flames, George ran toward them. No helmet, no weapon, just a civilian in work clothes sprinting toward hell. The USS Oklahoma was listing badly. Men were trapped inside. Their screams echoed through twisted metal. George didn't think. He acted. He grabbed a sledgehammer from a tool shed. The weight of it in his hands would become the weight of lives saved. The ship was capsizing. Water rushed through corridors. Time was measured in heartbeats. George swung that hammer like his life depended on it. But it wasn't his life. It was theirs. The first sailor he pulled through the hull was 19 years old. Bleeding, crying, alive. George didn't stop. Back into the smoke. Back into the chaos. Again and again. While Zeros strafed the harbor and explosions rocked the world apart, a dock worker became something more. By the time the attack ended, George Walters had pulled 17 men from certain death. His hands were raw, his clothes soaked in oil and blood. He never wore a uniform. He never took an oath. But on that morning, he embodied everything America would need to survive the war ahead. Ordinary people doing extraordinary things. George Walters wasn't born a hero. He was born in a small Kansas town where the biggest excitement was the county fair. His father fixed tractors, his mother baked pies for the church. They raised him to work hard, help others, and never back down from what's right. Simple values that would echo across an ocean. He came to Hawaii in 1938. The Depression had hit Kansas hard. Jobs were scarce. But the Navy needed workers in Pearl Harbor. Good pay, steady work, a chance to see the world. George packed everything he owned in a single suitcase. His mother cried at the train station. She had no idea her son would one day make history. The work was hard but honest, loading supplies, maintaining equipment, learning the rhythm of military life from the outside. George made friends with the sailors, shared cigarettes during breaks, listened to their stories of home. He wasn't one of them, but he was part of their world. Saturday nights, he'd join them at the local bars. They'd talk about girls back home, about dreams after service, about the war in Europe that seemed so far away. The sailors would joke that George was lucky. No uniform meant no orders. No danger. How wrong they were. George had a gift. He could fix anything. Engines, radios, pumps. His hands understood machinery the way musicians understand instruments. The sailors called him when official channels failed. He became the unofficial problem solver of Pearl Harbor. That reputation would matter more than anyone knew. He lived in a small apartment near the base. Simple. Clean. A radio for company. Letters from home every week. His mother always ended with the same words. Be safe. Help others. Make us proud. He kept every letter in a box under his bed. After December 7th, those words would haunt him, guide him, define him. The night before the attack, George couldn't sleep. Something felt different. The air was too still. The stars too bright. He walked to the harbor around midnight, watched the ships sleeping at anchor. The Arizona, the Oklahoma, the West Virginia, giants resting in paradise. He had no way of knowing he was looking at future graveyards. He finally slept around 3 a.m. 4 hours later, the world changed forever. But George Walters was ready, not because of training or preparation, but because sometimes ordinary people carry extraordinary courage inside them, waiting, ready to emerge when history demands it. The first wave hit at 7:48 a.m. 183 Japanese aircraft descended on Pearl Harbor like mechanical demons. Torpedo bombers skimmed the water. Dive bombers screamed from the clouds. Fighters strafed anything that moved. Paradise became purgatory in seconds. George was walking toward Dock 7 when the world exploded. The first torpedo hit the USS Oklahoma. The sound was unlike anything he'd ever heard. Not just an explosion. A death rattle of steel and steam. Men were thrown into the air like dolls. The massive battleship shuddered and began to list. Instinct should have made him run. Self-preservation should have kicked in. But George saw sailors in the water, some swimming, some not. Without thinking, he sprinted toward the edge of the dock. A Zero fighter spotted him. Bullets stitched the concrete inches from his feet. George didn't stop. He pulled the first sailor from the water. Kid couldn't have been more than 18. Uniform soaked in oil. Eyes wide with shock. George dragged him to safety, then went back. Another explosion. The USS Shaw erupted in a fireball that seemed to touch the sky. George kept moving. Around him, the world descended into chaos. Officers shouted orders no one could hear. Sailors ran to battle stations on ships already sinking. Anti-aircraft guns fired desperately at targets moving too fast to track. And in the middle of it all, a civilian dock worker was saving lives. The Oklahoma was rolling. Men trapped inside beat against the hull. Their fists made hollow sounds against the steel. Morse code, SOS, save our souls. George heard it and understood. Those men had minutes, maybe less. Water was flooding compartments, air pockets shrinking, death closing in. He remembered the tool shed, sprinted through smoke and flames, grabbed the sledgehammer and a crowbar. The weight felt right in his hands. Purpose given form. He ran back to the capsizing ship. Sailors tried to stop him. Too dangerous. Let the rescue teams handle it. But there were no rescue teams, not yet. Just chaos and death and time running out. George climbed onto the exposed hull. The ship was still rolling. Each degree meant more water, less air, less hope. He found a spot where the tapping was loudest, swung the hammer with everything he had. The clang echoed across the harbor. He swung again. Again. Metal began to give way. The hull of the Oklahoma was never meant to be breached from the outside. Inches of hardened steel designed to withstand enemy shells. But George Walters had something more powerful than any weapon: desperation, purpose, the knowledge that men were dying beneath his feet. Each swing of the hammer sent shockwaves through his arms. His work gloves tore, blood mixed with sweat. Around him, the attack continued. Another wave of planes arrived, more bombs, more death. A sailor grabbed George's shoulder, told him to take cover. George shrugged him off and kept swinging. Finally, a crack. Small at first. George wedged the crowbar in, leveraged with all his weight. The metal screamed and gave way. A hole, not big, but big enough. Water gushed out. Then a hand appeared. Reaching, desperate, alive. George grabbed that hand and pulled. A young sailor emerged, gasping, crying, saved. But there were more. The tapping continued. Different spots, different compartments, different souls waiting for salvation. George moved to the next spot, started again. Other men began to help. Sailors with tools, officers who understood. They formed teams, cutting, prying, pulling. But George led them, the civilian showing warriors how to save lives. By now his clothes were torn, his hands bleeding. He didn't notice. Couldn't notice. Not while men were dying. The second man he pulled out was a mechanic, covered in oil, half drowned but breathing. The third was an officer. The fourth, a cook, each face etched with terror and gratitude, each life a victory against death. 17 in total. 17 souls pulled from steel coffins. The Oklahoma continued to roll, eventually capsizing completely. 429 men died on that ship, but 17 lived because a dock worker couldn't quit. George worked until his body gave out, until other rescuers literally carried him away. He fought them, insisted more were trapped, had to save more. They laid him on a stretcher. His hands looked like raw meat. His clothes were unrecognizable. Someone asked his name, he could barely speak. George Walters, dock worker. Section 7. That's all. No rank, no serial number. Just a man who showed up when history called. The attack lasted 2 hours, 2 hours that felt like a lifetime. When the last Japanese plane disappeared over the horizon, Pearl Harbor looked like the end of the world. 21 ships damaged or sunk. 188 aircraft destroyed. 2,403 Americans dead. George woke up in a makeshift medical station. His hands were wrapped in bandages. A nurse was checking his vitals. She told him he'd been unconscious for 3 hours. Exhaustion, blood loss, shock. He tried to sit up. Asked about the men from the Oklahoma. How many survived? How many didn't? She didn't have answers. No one did yet. The full scope of the disaster was still being calculated, but she told him something that would stay with him forever. You saved 17 men. 17 families won't get telegrams. Because of you. Then she moved to the next patient. Heroes were common that day. Outside, Pearl Harbor burned. Oil fires sent black smoke into the perfect Hawaiian sky. The Arizona was gone. 1,200 men entombed in her hull. The West Virginia, Tennessee, Maryland, all damaged. The Pacific Fleet, the sword and shield of America in the Pacific, had been crippled in a single morning. George discharged himself that evening. The doctors protested. His hands needed proper treatment. He needed rest. But George knew the work wasn't done. Couldn't be done. He wrapped his bandages tighter and reported to his supervisor. The docks needed every hand, even damaged ones. For the next 72 hours, George worked without real sleep, clearing debris, helping with rescue operations, loading supplies for emergency repairs. His story spread among the workers and sailors, the civilian who'd charged into hell, who'd saved 17 men with nothing but a hammer and raw courage. An admiral heard about him, came to find him personally, offered him a commission on the spot, any branch he wanted, any position. George declined respectfully, said he wasn't a soldier, just a man who did what needed doing. The admiral shook his bandaged hand carefully, said that was exactly what soldiers were. The letters home were the hardest part. George wrote to his mother 3 days after the attack, told her he was fine, didn't mention the 17 men, didn't mention the blood or the fear or the way his hands shook when he tried to sleep. Just said there'd been trouble. He'd helped where he could. He was okay. The days after Pearl Harbor changed America. The sleeping giant had been awakened. Rage, fear, and determination mixed into something powerful. Young men lined up at recruiting stations, factories retooled for war production, a nation that had wanted peace prepared for the fight of its life. George stayed at Pearl Harbor. The Navy tried repeatedly to enlist him. Each time, he politely refused. He wasn't running from service. He believed he could do more good as a civilian. The docks needed experienced workers. Ships needed repairs. The war effort needed men like him exactly where he was. But December 7th had changed him. The nightmares started immediately. The sound of men trapped in steel, the weight of the hammer, the faces of those he'd saved, and worse, the knowledge of those he couldn't save. 429 men died on the Oklahoma. He'd saved 17. The math tortured him. He threw himself into work, 18-hour days, 7 days a week. If he worked hard enough, he couldn't think, couldn't remember. His supervisor tried to make him rest. George refused. Rest meant remembering. Remembering meant pain. Better to work. Always work. The 17 men he'd saved began visiting, one by one. They'd find him at the docks, shake his hand, try to express gratitude that couldn't be captured in words. Some cried, some just stood there, silent, understanding that they owed their lives to a man who wanted no recognition, no reward, just the knowledge that he'd made a difference. One sailor brought his wife. She was pregnant. Due in 3 months. They were naming the baby George if it was a boy, Georgia if a girl. George tried to protest, said he'd just done what anyone would do. The sailor's wife grabbed his hands. Still scarred, still healing. No, she said, not anyone. You. The war expanded. America struck back. Midway, Guadalcanal. The long road to victory began. George followed every battle. Every ship that left Pearl Harbor carried men he knew. friends. The sailors whose lives he'd saved went back to war. Some survived, some didn't. That was the hardest part. Saving a life, only to lose it later. He started a ritual. Every December 7th, he'd go to the harbor at 7:48 a.m., stand where he'd stood, remember. Not the heroics, not the lives saved, but the moment when an ordinary man made an extraordinary choice. When history called and he answered, when being human meant being more than human. As 1942 dawned, Pearl Harbor transformed from a scene of devastation to a symbol of American resilience. Ships thought lost forever were raised and repaired. The West Virginia, the California. Even the Nevada, beached during the attack, returned to service. America was proving that December 7th was not an ending, it was a beginning. George's story spread beyond Hawaii. Reporters wanted interviews. The War Department wanted to use him for morale. A civilian hero, proof that every American could make a difference. George refused it all. Publicity made him uncomfortable. He wasn't a symbol. He was a dock worker. Nothing more. Nothing less. But the 17 men he'd saved wouldn't let his story die. They wrote letters to newspapers, told his story in bars and barracks, made sure people knew that heroes didn't always wear uniforms. Sometimes they wore work clothes and carried sledgehammers. Sometimes they were ordinary people who refused to be ordinary when it mattered. The war ground on. George's hands healed but never fully recovered. The scars were deep. Nerve damage made fine work difficult. But he adapted, found new ways to do his job. The pain was a reminder. Every ache meant 17 families still whole, 17 futures still possible. It was a price he paid gladly. One day a package arrived from Kansas. His mother had sent cookies and a letter. She'd heard. Everyone back home had heard. The local paper ran the story. Local boy saved 17 at Pearl Harbor. She was proud. His father was proud. The whole town was proud. But her letter ended differently than usual. Be safe, you've helped enough, come home. George couldn't go home. Not yet. The war wasn't over. Ships still needed repair, sailors still needed support, and somehow being at Pearl Harbor felt right. Like penance for the ones he couldn't save. Like honor for the ones he did. This place of tragedy had become his purpose. He made friends with the new arrivals. Fresh-faced kids heading to war. They'd heard his story. Wanted to shake his hand. Touch a piece of living history. George always turned the conversation to them, their homes, their hopes, their fears. He became a confessor of sorts, the civilian who understood. Late at night, alone in his apartment, he'd sometimes take out the list, 17 names. He'd memorize them all, where they were from, what ships they served on next, who made it home, who didn't. The list was his burden and his blessing, proof that one person could matter, evidence that even in humanity's darkest moments, light could shine through. By 1943, the tide of war had turned. America was on the offensive. Island by island, battle by battle. The road to Tokyo was being paved in blood and courage. Many of the 17 men George saved were part of that road. Their letters came from places with names like Tarawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima. One sailor, Tommy Morrison from the Oklahoma, wrote regularly. He'd been the fourth man George pulled from the hull. 19 years old, scared. Now he was a petty officer on a destroyer. He wrote about battles, about fear, about the strange guilt of surviving when others didn't. George understood that guilt, carried it himself. Another saved sailor didn't write. Couldn't write. He died at Midway, defending the carrier Yorktown. His widow sent George a letter, thanked him for giving her 2 more years with her husband, for giving her daughter memories of her father. The letter broke something in George, made him question if saving lives was worth it when war kept taking them. A chaplain at Pearl Harbor noticed George's struggle, saw the weight he carried. They talked. Not about God or fate or meaning, just about the burden of surviving. The chaplain had been there on December 7th too, had held dying men, had failed to save most. He understood George's pain. They became unlikely friends. You gave them choice, the chaplain said one evening. They chose to serve, to fight, to risk everything for something bigger. You didn't save them from death. You saved them from a meaningless death. Trapped, helpless. You gave them the chance to make their lives count. The words helped. Some. George started visiting the memorial services every December 7th. As the war continued, these services grew, became more than mourning, became celebration, defiance, promise. The dead of Pearl Harbor hadn't died in vain. Their sacrifice had awakened a nation, started a crusade that would end tyranny, change the world. He met families of the fallen, mothers, wives, children. They thanked him for trying, for caring, for proving that Americans looked after each other. Some asked why their loved ones couldn't have been saved too. George had no answers, only shared grief. Only the promise that their sacrifice was remembered, always remembered. The work at the docks continued. Ships came and went, damaged from battles across the Pacific. George helped repair them all, each rivet, each weld. Each repair was his contribution to victory. His hands might have been scarred, but they still worked, still served, still honored the memory of December 7th. The war ended on August 15, 1945. Japan surrendered. The killing stopped. The world exhaled. In Pearl Harbor, men wept, cheered, hugged strangers. The long nightmare was over. America had survived, prevailed. But the cost had been terrible. Over 400,000 Americans dead. Millions more wounded. Families shattered. George stood at the docks that day, watched the celebrations, felt the joy, but also felt the weight. The war was over, but the scars remained. Physical, mental, spiritual. He thought of the 17 men. 12 had survived the war, 5 hadn't. Those 5 haunted him, made victory bittersweet. The Navy held a ceremony, wanted to honor civilian workers who'd contributed to the war effort. George was specifically named, asked to attend, to finally accept recognition. He went reluctantly, wore his best clothes, stood in the back, tried to be invisible. But the 17 men had other plans. The 12 survivors had organized, come from across the country. They stood when George's name was called, started clapping, others joined. Soon the entire room was standing, applauding. For the dock worker who'd shown that courage didn't require a uniform, that heroism was about choices, not circumstances. They presented him with something unexpected. Not a medal, not a plaque, but a sledgehammer, engraved with 17 names, the dates they'd been saved. A simple inscription. When history called, he answered. George held it, felt its weight. Different from that morning in 1941, heavier with meaning, lighter with peace. After the ceremony, the 12 survivors and George spent the evening together, talking, remembering, healing. They shared stories of the 5 who hadn't made it home, celebrated their lives, mourned their loss, but also acknowledged the gift George had given them all, the chance to choose their fate, to serve, to matter. One survivor, now a lieutenant commander, made a toast to George Walters, who taught us that heroes don't always wear capes or uniforms. Sometimes they wear work clothes. Sometimes they're just people who see others in need and act, who run toward danger when everyone else runs away, who prove that ordinary people can do extraordinary things. George finally spoke, thanked them for their service, for their sacrifice, for making his actions meaningful. I just swung a hammer, he said. You won the war. You're the heroes. They disagreed. Said heroism came in many forms. That December 7th had shown America's true character. Civilians and sailors, workers and warriors, all united, all heroic. Years passed, decades. The world changed. The veterans of World War II aged. Their numbers dwindled. But every December 7th, George Walters returned to Pearl Harbor, no longer as a worker. He'd retired in 1967, but as a keeper of memory, a link to that day when everything changed. He'd stand at the memorial, now a national monument, watch the oil still seeping from the Arizona, rainbow slicks on the water, tears of a ship still weeping for her dead. Tourists would come, take pictures, sometimes recognize him, the civilian hero of Pearl Harbor. He'd talk to them, especially the young ones. Make sure they understood. Heroes aren't special people, he'd say. They're regular people who make special choices. When that moment comes, and it comes for everyone eventually, you don't have time to think about being brave. You just act. You do what needs doing. That's all heroism is, doing what needs doing when it needs doing. The 12 survivors kept in touch. Their numbers also dwindled. 5 by 1980, 3 by 1990. By 2000, only one remained. Tommy Morrison, the scared 19-year-old from Oklahoma, now a grandfather. He visited George every December 7th. Two old men remembering when they were young, when the world burned, when 17 lives hung in the balance. George never married, never had children, said the 17 men were his legacy. Their children and grandchildren were his extended family. They sent Christmas cards, graduation announcements, wedding invitations, proof that his actions that morning had rippled through generations, created futures, enabled dreams. In his final years, George donated the engraved sledgehammer to the Pearl Harbor Memorial, asked that it be displayed with a simple message: "In our darkest moments we find our greatest strength, not in weapons or warships, but in each other. In the willingness of ordinary people to do extraordinary things, to run toward danger, to save strangers, to prove that humanity's greatest power is humanity itself." George Walters died peacefully on December 6, 2010. One day before the anniversary, his final words to Tommy Morrison: "Tell them I was just a dock worker. Tell them anyone could have done it. Tell them that's the point. Anyone could have, I just did." His funeral was attended by hundreds, descendants of the 17, military brass, civilians, all honoring a man who proved that heroism has no uniform. Today, at Pearl Harbor, children learn about December 7, 1941. They learn about the ships, the planes, the tactics. But they also learn about George Walters, the civilian with the sledgehammer, the man who saved 17, the proof that inside every ordinary person lies the potential for extraordinary courage. We just have to choose. When history calls, we have to answer. Like George did. Like we all can. Like you can. Remember his story. Share it. Because somewhere, right now, someone faces their December 7th moment. Their chance to matter, to save lives, to change history. They might be wearing a uniform, they might be wearing work clothes, they might be you. The only question is, when your moment comes, will you answer the call? Like this video, subscribe to this channel, share your thoughts below. Do you have family who served, who showed courage? Tell their stories, keep their memories alive. This channel exists to prove that history isn't just about dates and battles. It's about people. Ordinary people who refuse to be ordinary, who answered when history called, who remind us that inside each of us beats the heart of a hero. We just have to listen. And when the moment comes, we have to act.